What's up? What's up? I'm Dr. Omatma, host of Egg Meets Sperm, where we're busting fertility myths, sharing tangible tips for your fertility journey, and bringing you the most knowledgeable guests to support your journey to parenthood. This podcast is for both women and men because getting fertile as fuck is for both partners, don't you think? Remember, just listening to this podcast won't get you pregnant, but following the tips we share just may. Let's get you fertile AF so that you can co-create the family you dream of. And if your partner's not listening to this, make sure to share this episode with your partner. Hello and welcome to Egg Meets Sperm. My guest today is Dr. Miles Nichols, who is a functional medicine doctor specializing in Lyme, mold illness, gut, thyroid, and autoimmunity. After Dr. Miles personally struggled with chronic fatigue in his early 20s, Dr. Miles dedicated himself to figuring out the root cause. He suffered and recovered from thyroid dysfunction, autoimmunity, a gut infection, Lyme co-infections, and mold illness. He has also co-authored a book with Dr. Diane Mueller, How to Use Your Mind to Heal Your Mold and Lyme and Stress Resilience. They founded the Medicine with Heart Functional Medicine Clinic in Colorado, as well as the Medicine with Heart Institute that trains other doctors in functional medicine. I am so excited to have you here. Welcome, Dr. Miles.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here and looking forward to diving in.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were talking a little bit offline before we got on. And first, I'm just super intrigued. Let's just start there. I literally just told him that we were going to talk about mental health and mind stuff, but the title of this book is so intriguing. And how do you use your mind to heal infections? I know you can't. You probably can't tell me in 2 minutes, but you know.
Well, yeah, it's really interesting because a lot of people think, oh, there's this physiologic issue like an infection. And so physiologic treatments are that thing to do. You need an antibiotic for an infection. And what's been hard about some of these chronic infections, things like Lyme disease, Epstein-Barr virus, several others, are that they have these virulence mechanisms. You can kind of kill them off with antibiotics, but they kind of come back and they lie latent and dormant. And the long-term strategy to dealing with these things is really to get the immune function resilient. When immune function is resilient and the nervous system is balanced, there can be this sense of those latent pathogens stay latent and they're not reactivating, they're not causing a ruckus in the body. And so there are very specific and research practices. For example, there's a breath practice that's been researched where they'll inject dead E. coli direct into the bloodstream, which E. coli, when it's dead, it's got what's called lipopolysaccharide or LPS. It's a toxin in the cell wall. It's called an endotoxin. When people have leaky gut, they get a lot of endotoxin in their bloodstream when they have chronic infections. Some of the reason they feel ill is due to endotoxins. And when people are in a mold environment, when they're in a building that has mold, often it also has bacteria, and that bacteria produces endotoxin. They're breathing endotoxin in from the environment. So there's multiple sources of endotoxin, but there is a study where they took and they inject this dead E. coli. And what most people find is that they get really ill. They have headaches. They feel miserable, flu-like symptoms. They're in a bad way for a few hours. This has been repeated with over 1,000 people, so it's not just a few people. And there are some people who decided they're going to do this breathing technique, this breathing and mindset technique where they're going to be injected while they're doing this breath work. And what they found is they had almost no symptoms whatsoever from endotoxin. And they did find that they were able to adjust the autonomic nervous system and the adaptive immune response consciously. And that was thought, it was so revolutionary that they actually added a chapter to some of the medical textbooks saying that we thought that the autonomic nervous system wasn't within conscious control. You can't say heart rate speed up or heart rate slow down or blood pressure increase or blood pressure decrease. However, there is this one study that showed that people were consciously deciding to breathe in a way that we saw the inflammatory markers, interleukin 6, interleukin 2, cut in about half. The anti-inflammatory marker, interleukin 10, doubled. Adrenaline went way up, but cortisol didn't. And there was this elimination, essentially, of symptoms that were present for almost everyone else. So there are ways to adapt the immune response and the nervous system response with the mind and breath work and certain aspects of conscious control of the physiology, which is really a revolutionary concept that's just starting to be grasped today.
Yeah. It's pretty phenomenal, like how much we don't actually know as doctors and scientists, right? And as that science starts becoming more accessible and more research, it's becoming more and more apparent that there's a lot that we didn't know.
Yeah, absolutely.
That sounds amazing. So, for those of you listening in, you want to go check out his book so that you can get all the deets on how to use your mind to overcome infections. But I do want to talk a little bit more about mold and Lyme and other chronic infections that could potentially be impacting people's hormones and fertility. So, can we start kind of diving into what you've seen and how this connects with fertility?
Absolutely. And there's a number of ways in which we see connections here between infections, toxins, hormones, and fertility. There's direct and indirect connections. And certainly one of the hallmarks that we're looking for when, for example, someone's been exposed to mold toxin, there's a subset of people who are genetically predisposed to accumulate that toxin in the body and not be able to appropriately get rid of it. And we do a genetic test to look for this, to see if people, and it's about 24% of the population, about 1 in 4 people who have this genetic predisposition that their immune system doesn't recognize a mold toxin as a problem and doesn't initiate the process of getting rid of it from the body. So instead, that mycotoxin can become lodged in fat tissue or adipose tissue, or sometimes even in organ systems in the brain. And we have fMRI imaging that shows a certain kind of an fMRI image that shows damaged certain parts of the brain. And one of the things that tends to get damaged is the pituitary gland and its function. The pituitary gland is a gland that can secrete precursors to hormones. So the pituitary gland is secreting, for example, thyroid stimulating hormone that's telling the thyroid to make thyroid hormone. It's secreting follicular stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So this is sort of like at the top of the hormone chain. This is how the brain is telling the body to make the hormones. And what happens with mold illness is we often see an inhibition or a lowering of pituitary function, of, in particular, something called melanocyte stimulating hormone. And although melanocyte stimulating hormone is largely understood to relate to the skin tanning effect, it actually has a nervous system arousal effect, a libido effect, a metabolic effect. So with metabolism and metabolic function, and it relates also to other hormone function in the body. So we frequently see hormone depletions and or dysregulation, and with mold toxin accumulation in the body, creating an inflammatory response affecting the brain signaling to hormone. With infections, we often see chronic infections also having their own toxin release. Infections like Lyme can release neurotoxins. As those infections get killed off, the cell wall has those endotoxins like LPS. And those toxins also in and of themselves can affect the liver function, the brain function, the way the body breaks down hormones and recycles them, and then gut function as well. Oftentimes when I see chronic recurrent gut issues, like for example, a small intestinal bacterial overgrowth or an IBS, an irritable bowel syndrome, where people have tried a bunch of treatments for the gut and it keeps coming back, especially with constipation or methane type SIBO. Often I find that there is a chronic infection like Lyme present that's driving continued dysregulation of that gut and gut barrier and continued issues with constipation and digestive issues. Bacteria can cause an enzyme called beta-glucuronidase to upregulate, and that enzyme can actually break apart the glucuronide bond. And the glucuronide bond is how the liver gets rid of estrogen. So it's getting a little complicated, but the body gets rid of estrogen in part by breaking it apart and attaching these little, almost like you could think of it like little sticky notes that say, hey, this is trash, like take it out with the trash, and breaks it apart, puts it into the bile, sends it into the intestines. And the body would normally get rid of it with stool. This ends with infections, overgrowth. Sometimes we can see that this enzyme is upregulated that breaks apart those bonds, like takes off the tag that says it's trash. Sometimes they can reform, recirculate, and create issues with hormonal balance that way as well. There are quite a few different mechanisms by which we see there can be issues. And then autoimmunity would be a whole nother topic that they can trigger autoimmune issues.
Sure.
And then that can affect fertility.
Yeah. So there's basically like a lot of connections in how these different types of infections are impacting hormones. So when you were talking about the mold initially, is that someone who has maybe been highly exposed to mold and potentially has that gene where the system doesn't detect mold as a toxin? Do those people often have mega suppression of hormones? So then it looks like their body's not actually producing hormones, or like, what does this look like clinically?
Yeah. Many times what we see with mold toxin accumulation is that, especially when someone has that gene, and it almost never gets identified, in part because you can have multiple people living in the same home and only one has the gene, or maybe multiple have the gene, but only one is expressing that gene and getting really ill. So it's hard to suspect the home. So a lot of people say, oh, well, my spouse is okay, so it must not be the home, and it gets missed. So I just want to throw that out there because that's a common thing that people don't realize. And then when it comes to how it affects hormone levels, it is usually a downregulation. So for men, often testosterone levels become low, and we'll see that their testosterone and free testosterone levels, which then can impact sperm count and quality, end up becoming less, plus these inflammatory markers. And we know when we're working on fertility for men, some of these antioxidative, anti-inflammatory constituents and supplements so end up having some benefit there. And mold you could consider to be an oxidative agent. It's creating oxidative stress in the brain and the body. So you're actually dealing with a bigger oxidative load than just normal life with these toxins. So you're dealing with whatever that would cause in its own right, plus a downregulation in the hormone level itself. For women, it tends to be a little more complex. It can be sometimes,
Women are just so complex.
So very often what happens with the adrenal hormones is those tend to become first hyper and then hypo. So cortisol will for a time go to an excessive level, and then there's some resistance that forms, and then it can go to a chronically low level. And during the chronically high level, there's a little more anxiety, there's a little more typically a wired feeling, there's a little more irritability. When it goes low, it's a little more on the fatigue side, it's a little more on the depleted side, feeling like there's not enough vim and vigor to get going and then do all the things that you should be doing in order to keep a healthful lifestyle and body and mind. And so that's on the adrenal side. And then that influences thyroid. We know that cortisol impacts thyroid stimulating hormone and T3 conversion in the active form of thyroid. And we know thyroid's so important in the fertility process, and especially in the actual pregnancy process. And so we see this often either a low normal thyroid function, which would not get diagnosed usually as hypothyroid, or sometimes we see actual Hashimoto's or a thyroid antibody. And this is especially true with Lyme. We have an overlap. There's a study that shows the protein structure of Lyme. Part of it looks exactly like thyroid protein structure. And so the immune system, when it's attacking Lyme, sometimes cross-reacts in genetically predisposed individuals. There's what we call a cross-reactivity or a molecular mimicry, where the immune system, it's like two friends or two people, they look almost exactly alike, and one of them is the enemy, one of them's the friend. You send the police after one of them, they might get both of them. So it's this sense of the immune system is often cross-reacting with tissue in the body, unintentionally trying to get rid of an infection. So we know Lyme, we know Epstein-Barr virus are two that cross-react with thyroid protein, and it's likely that some of the toxins from mold may cross-react with thyroid, certainly cross-react with some tissues in the brain and other areas. So we get this immune system attacking the thyroid gland itself, leading to subclinical or sometimes clinical levels of thyroid deficiency. And then we have the estrogen progesterone piece, where sometimes the egg quality is okay and the egg will drop, but we often see, for example, significant DHEA suppression. And we know DHEA clinically, when we give it, it helps with ovarian reserve issues. And so there's a relationship there. It's not fully fleshed out in research as to is DHEA suppression going to cause infertility? We know DHEA repletion is going to help with the ovarian reserves.
Sure.
But there's sort of an outstanding question that I can't speak from research to, but I suspect that there might be some ovarian reserve issues that might take effect from a chronic inflammatory response syndrome due to mold, but we don't have the research to know for sure.
And there is a little bit of research, it's not extensive, to speak to exactly what you're saying in terms of mold as well as other chronic infections potentially being indicated or correlated to women suffering with premature ovarian failure or premature ovarian insufficiency. And those are essentially states in which their egg reserves have suddenly dropped off of a cliff and they're well under 35. So some of that does correlate, but I think that there is this growing body of research that's needed to really help flesh out all of the relationships, because as you've been pointing to, there's just a lot happening throughout the body in different ways, in different places, and the impact of those things is far-reaching.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad you have touched in on some of that research, and I hope we get more to see how deep it goes. I mean, I've treated a patient, we were treating her for mold illness, and she was told she was infertile. She was in her 40s. She didn't think anything of even thinking about protection. And all of a sudden, after some treatment, she's pregnant. And she was like, whoa, I didn't think this could even happen. So yeah, we see sometimes you clear this chronic inflammatory response, this toxic burden, this inflammatory or infectious burden from the body. And it's almost like the body says, oh, now I can focus my energy on reproduction, that I'm not stressed out by all this load and burden anymore.
Absolutely. I think at the core of it, and like while you were describing the cortisol pattern that you've seen with infections, it's like initially more wired and then more tired. And that's literally like any stressor over a long period of time is going to have that same pattern, right? So basically the body sees these infections or these underlying things as physiological stressor. And this is where I think a lot of times people are like, but I'm not stressed. And I'm like, well,
Yeah.
Your patterns show that you're stressed. So let's figure out where it's coming from. And it's hard. With mold, I'm curious if a lot of people come to you after they've had symptoms for a long time, or if it's something that they're just like, I don't know what to do. I'm just going to come see you. And then suddenly you're like, yeah, you have mold or you have this chronic underlying infection you never knew about or something like that.
Yeah, it's a mix. Some people are the mystery case of, I've been to a bunch of different practitioners. No one's been able to figure out really what's going on other than I've gotten diagnosed with this autoimmune issue or irritable bowel syndrome, or these syndromes, especially like fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome, irritable bowel syndrome, are these almost cop-out diagnoses. They're like, it's a collection of symptoms, but we don't know actually what's going on. It's sort of like, but we're going to put a label on it so we sound confident in what we're dealing with. And then we can make a drug for it because we have a label. But so it's weird, but it's setting that aside. I mean, there's good and bad to labels, and that's a whole nother conversation. Sometimes they can become an externalization of the internal control onto the label, and that can become problematic in a victim mindset. But there's also value to seeing, no, there's a name for this and other people experience it. I'm not alone. So there's good and bad about that. But often with fibromyalgia, or chronic fatigue syndrome, or multiple chemical sensitivity, or people who are struggling with mental health issues like depression or anxiety, often these issues boil back to some combination of toxin, infection, gut dysfunction, cellular dysfunction, and a few other things. But the toxins and infections are often a big missing part. And I recommend people start with diet and do some stuff on diet and lifestyle and get that dialed in and get sleep dialed in, and then maybe do some gut work. And that's a good order. And I usually get the people who say, I've done the dietary stuff, I've gotten good sleep, I've dialed my lifestyle, I have managed my stress to the best that I can, I've been on a few different rounds of gut protocols, and I'm still feeling off. I'm still struggling with chronic pain or with energy issues. So those are the primary people that I get. Some of them I get where they've gone so far as to identify that they do have Lyme, or they are living in mold, or that they were living in mold and they're not anymore, but they're still dealing with symptoms. And maybe they've even started on those treatments, but they're still stuck. They're still feeling like those treatments haven't been effective yet. And I'll get those people and we'll dig a little deeper and try to figure out why the treatments they've done so far are not effective. So those are the majority of people that I get in my clinic. And I do encourage, if you like, if you're on standard American diet, of course, like do the dietary work first. It doesn't make sense to go after a chronic late infection or a mold toxin issue if you're still eating fast food and drinking soda and stuff like that. But once you've gotten to a reasonable baseline on diet, you're getting good sleep, you've done some work on your lifestyle, you're getting movement, and you're doing a little bit of work on the gut, and then you're still feeling off, it's a really good time to take a look at one of these deeper things and see if it might be impacting your health.
So mold in particular seems extra scary because often it's correlated to I'm going to need to figure out where it is in my house or where it is that I'm being exposed to this. If it's not at house, maybe at work, wherever. And then B, the kind of undertaking that entails. Having been through it myself, it's like, yeah, it was basically like, let's rip out half of our house and essentially like rebuild everything from scratch. And of course, like I'm crazy and I'm like, get rid of this. Like, I do not want this in my house. But the average person is not so likely to just want to like rip out half of their house and have the resources to do that always. So I'm curious what you suggest for those people, or if there is at least a solution that will make their body less predisposed to reacting to the mold.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little crazy. So one of the environmental organizations estimated that 1 in 2 American homes are water damaged, and it's even higher for schools and churches and these big buildings. And because we put pipes in walls, people thought for a while, oh, it's just the humid areas. If I live in a humid area, I'm going to move to a dry area and I'm going to be okay. But actually, they studied the difference between humid and dry areas, and it's about the same in terms of how many homes still have water damage. And you have to understand we do run water through walls and pipes, and there's roofs and basements, and there are ways to make it worse or better, homes that are more likely or less likely. And the build quality and structure, in some sense, has gotten better, in some sense worse, because it used to be there was a little more airflow because the seams weren't quite as tight, and there was a little bit of actual airflow and pressure through cracks and seams, and that actually dries out moisture. And the more insulated we've gotten and the less airflow there is, the more that moisture, if it does occur, sits there and becomes moldy. So there's several things to tease apart here. One is like, is mold actually making a person sick or ill? Because if you're living in a small amount of mold, then it may not be that you're ill from that mold. And so it's not a matter necessarily of everyone needs to 100% eliminate all mold. It's also, some mold is known to be toxic to humans, other mold is not. So there are a lot of outdoor molds that don't have toxins that aren't going to be significantly impactful to health. And there are 5 molds that are highly toxic that definitely are impactful to health. And there are many others that can have some degrees of toxicity that can be impactful to health. So there's one dust sample that people can do called a Hertzme that just tests the 5 most toxic mold spores in a sample.
Spell that out.
HERTSMI.
Okay.
Hertzme.
Yeah, that's not what I would have picked up. So thank you.
HERTSMI 2, the number 2 is usually what it's called. And a Hertzme just does the 5 most toxic molds. And it's a lower cost than doing an ERMI, ERMI. And ERMI tests more molds, though, and has a more comprehensive view. And then there are tests for endotoxins and actinomycetes, and there's lots of other things.
And so explain this test to me. What kind of sample do you need to collect to send to them?
Yeah.
Dust. Okay.
Yeah, so it's a dust sample. You could collect a piece of a filter, or you can take a pad and collect dust. And the way it should be all on the same floor, but it can be in different rooms. And it's old dust that you want to collect, typically like on the top of picture frames or on the top of bookcases. You want to get enough dust that you get a good composite sample, maybe 18 square feet total, that you're wiping with this cloth. And it can be a composite from different rooms on the same floor. Where you spend a lot of time is usually where I tell people to do it first, or if you have a suspicion of water damage in an area, to do it there. And then you send it in, and it's a DNA analysis on the dust that looks for spores of the molds that are the most toxic. So these 5 most toxic molds. And then it gives a count for the concentration per amount of dust of these spores. And then it gives a score. And the score then tells you a little bit about whether it's significant or not. So a Hertzme score of less than 12 is pretty good. Most people can live healthful lives, and it hurts me less than between 12 to 14 starts to get borderline. 16 and above is problematic for people typically. So it's scored based on these counts, and it really depends on a combination of how ill is a person, what symptoms are they experiencing, and we can do things like we can do the genetic to see if they're genetically predisposed. It's a blood test. And then we also can look at, there's a very simple visual test that can help because we know a certain part of the visual system that detects contrast has been researched and associated to be affected by those who are accumulating toxin from mold and exposed to higher levels of mold. And so we can look at if the visual system is affected with a very simple at-home visual test people can do on the computer. We can get a sense for a blood test to look at their genetic and a couple of inflammatory markers that we know to be, they're not normal inflammatory markers. Almost never are they run in a conventional doctor visit, but they're very specialized inflammatory markers that we know to be elevated largely due to mold accumulation and sometimes due to infection, but they're not inflammatory markers that would be
like what?
Like transcription growth factor beta 1 or TGF beta 1. MMP9, matrix metalloproteinase 9, is an enzyme that breaks down elastase tissue in the lungs. It's part of, and some people confuse this because they're in mold and they have a lung issue and it's immediate. That might be an allergy. But someone who's living in mold for a long time, in the beginning, they didn't have any sneezing or breathing issues or asthmatic issues, but later they start to develop lung issues, then that often is an elevation of MMP9 that's breaking down the elastase tissue in the lung and causing longer standing issues. And so MMP9 and TGF beta 1 are two of the most common ones. There's complement C4A is another inflammatory marker that can elevate with mold. And then there's the melanocyte stimulating hormone we talked about earlier that gets low in mold exposure. And so that one gets low, a couple inflammatory markers get high. We have the genetic issue that we see often when we do that gene. And then we have the visual disturbance that goes off. And what's interesting about it is someone could have mold illness and not be living in mold. And people don't always understand that. If someone has the gene and they're accumulating this into their tissue and they move out of a moldy place, but they've already accumulated a lot, enough to cause a chronic inflammatory response. While they may feel a little better not having ongoing exposure, the body isn't still necessarily able to appropriately detoxify and get rid of it because they have the gene issue where they can't get rid of it appropriately. And if that gene continues to express as they move, even if it was 10 years ago or 5 years ago that they lived in a moldy place, they may still be carrying a chronic inflammatory response syndrome from historic exposure. If I'm looking at someone and we're testing the gene and the inflammatory markers and the visual test, and we see the visual test is off, they have the gene, the inflammatory markers are elevated, the next question becomes, is it current or historic exposure? If it's current exposure and we do that hurts me or an ERMI on the home and we see elevated mold levels in the home, then you do have to do something about the home and we can talk about that. But it might be that the home is okay now and that it was a historic mold exposure from a previous living environment, or that it's from a work environment, or that it's from a school or a church or other places. And then it's a lot easier because people don't have to deal with their home environment.
Wow. This is such a cool conversation because I do feel like 1 in 2, that's a really staggering statistic for how many homes have water damage. And that's really scary because I live in Houston. But I like that it's not any worse in human environments. So that's great. But I think that just what you've shared in terms of awareness, and just last week we talked to one of our ladies who has mold on a toxin screen is off the charts for her. So we're going to kind of go down this rabbit hole, and she was kind of freaking out. But as we were talking to her, she was like, oh yeah, you know what? The old place we used to live at had this mold patch that we didn't find until we started moving all of our stuff out. And I was like, okay. And what was happening in your life at that time? All of these symptoms, like she was having some crazy nervous system stuff going on. And it was just really interesting for them to be like, oh, now all the dots connect, right? And it may not be a current exposure, which is good, but the impact of it is still happening in the body. So I think so much of what you've shared is very resonant. Like the awareness around it is really, really important. So thank you.
Yeah, and especially when they've done all the basic stuff. There's no good reason for the issues to still be occurring, be them symptoms or infertility issues, that it seems like, why is this going on? It's a little unexplained. It's a little mystery. Like the normal blood markers all look pretty good. Then that's a case where looking at these specialized inflammatory markers and visual contrast test and looking in the home for mold can be really awakening of, oh, okay, I see why that might have occurred, and I see how that could be affecting me now. And someone does identify that the current home is an issue. I mean, that's scary. And a lot of people don't want to go down the world of investigating if mold is an issue because they know that they're not prepared to move or they're not prepared to remediate their home. And so I would say that there are some homes where a certain Hertz me score or ERMI score comes in and I say there's no other way than to either remediate or move. But many times there are these mid-level scores where it's like, okay, some basic things without full remediation may be enough, together with doing some things to help your body to be able to deal with this toxic burden. And there are quite a few people who fall in that category where it doesn't have to be burn everything, move. It doesn't have to be that extreme.
Okay, so I know that some people might be thinking this, so I'm going to ask this question, and it's probably going to sound silly to you. But chlorine, is it a myth or is it real to like apply chlorine to visible mold to get rid of it? And does it actually do anything?
Yeah, if you put bleach on mold, while bleach can kill mold, it also, I mean, just like think about an organism, right? And the organism is being killed. It has some things that it does in that time. And one of the things that mold does is it puffs out spores. So when mold is exposed to moisture, this is one of the things that people don't understand. So let's say you had a basement flood and there was some moisture issue in the basement and it was wet for a couple of days while someone brought down these fans and they were drying it out because you figured it out, but it was raining and it's still a little bit wet a couple days later. Within 24 to 48 hours, some mold can start to grow. And so if it dries out, let's say the porous materials like the drywall and the wood have started to dry out, but there's still mold there. Now that mold it doesn't die. Just because you dried it out, it doesn't die. People don't understand that necessarily. If you dry mold out, it goes dormant, but it doesn't die. And as soon as the moisture levels or the humidity levels, and this is where being in a humid environment is a little worse, even though mold might be there everywhere. In a humid environment, after that mold has grown, when it's exposed to higher humidity levels, it starts to puff spore out. So it will begin to reproduce and puff spore out, and that spore goes into the air, and attached to that spore are these mycotoxins. And you breathe the spores in, and the mycotoxin are small enough that they can get through the lung barrier and they can get into the bloodstream. Very, very small. And so the air in the home, and usually even if that's in the basement, the HVAC circulates it, it goes through the whole home. People are breathing in these spore, and the mycotoxin get into the bloodstream. And then if the body can detox it, okay, great. If it can't, then it accumulates and creates chronic inflammatory response. And so what that means is that if you put bleach on mold, it'll do the same thing it does in response to humidity. It puffs out a lot of spore. Now you have a higher concentration of spore in the air. And while it can kill some of the organism, it can cause, and especially when I see someone who is mold sensitive and they themselves are applying bleach, that's a bad scenario because now that just puffed out a bunch of spore. They're breathing it in. It's accumulating more. It's causing bigger issues. And so the only for sure appropriate way to treat mold is to remove the material and replace it. And to dry it out, unless it was dried out within a couple hours, the mold didn't grow. Once mold has grown, the really only appropriate way is to, on a porous material, if it's a non-porous material, if it's metal, you can scrub it off. But if it's a porous material, if it's raw wood that's unfinished or particle board, or if it's drywall, then it won't come off of that. So you have to cut it out and replace it. And putting bleach on it might kill some of the surface, but also puff spore and it won't
That's gonna
permeate all
spread
the way
through.
in. And now it's still in there. And it's a false sense of security plus an actual acute increase in spore
Yeah.
count.
Yeah. I know we're going so over, but this is like fascinating. Are there any air filters that actually filter mold spores? Because a lot of people claim that they do, but do they actually work?
Yeah, so the micron size of mycotoxins is quite small. So most air filters aren't small enough to do it. However, there are some air filters that do have HEPA that are more than normal HEPAs. For example, IQ Air has what they call a hyper HEPA, or some air filters have hospital grade HEPAs, Air Oasis. So there are a couple brands that have a level of filtration that does go down to less than the 0.3 micron or even the 0.1 micron that would capture mold spore and mold toxin. So those can be helpful. And again, they don't compensate for cutting out and replacing water damaged materials because you're going to constantly have some spore in the air, even if the air purifier is getting some of it out. But they are good. And if we're in that mid range of like a level of spore that's like, okay, it's maybe a problem, maybe not, but like if we can add some air filters and if we can do some cleaning procedures and if we can really make sure those bathrooms are fully vented and clean off any of the hard surfaces, the non-porous surfaces, and get the mold off of those, then sometimes those practices and then maybe an enzymatic solution on surfaces to break down some of what might be there and getting the dust up and really keeping less dust around that harbors the spores, then getting good airflow and maybe get a whole house fan, maybe really keep the windows open enough to get good airflow. Those strategies can be enough sometimes to deal with a situation that's moderate. So I do like air filters that have the very fine, like more than a regular HEPA kind of a filter in them.
Right. Okay. I don't even know if it's a filter, but we've got offered this like, oh, do you want to attach a UV to your whole house air filtration? And I was like, I don't know. Does that work?
Yeah, UV will kill bacteria and viruses. And in terms of mold, it's a dead spore versus a live spore still has a mycotoxin attached to it. You kill with UV a spore. Well, that's good, but it doesn't break down the toxin. The toxin's still there. You can still breathe in a dead mold spore and the toxin can still get into the body. So it's not going to get rid of the toxin, but it helps with viruses and certain other bacteria. And it might slow the spread of mold if those spores aren't attaching to other areas, are damp and wet. And I mean, hopefully you don't have areas that are damp and wet where it could grow. So it could potentially help the spread, but I wouldn't say that it gets rid of the toxin, the mycotoxin.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Wow. This is amazing. Thank you so much for staying on with me. I had to ask because I know a lot of people ask me these questions and I was like, I'm not a mold expert. I have no idea.
Yeah.
So really wonderful. I know that you have a really great gift for our listeners. Do you want to share what it is?
Yeah. So I have a guide that helps people understand a little bit more about mold and Lyme and the mind body approach to those. And because it's a little confusing, some people get really sensitive to certain supplements and foods, and it's really hard for them to know where do I start. And often, I mean, this gets into very complex biochemistry, but there are these pathways. There's this NRF2 pathway and there's this MRP2 protein. And the NRF2 can block this, can create this inflammatory chain. Sometimes we need to unblock it before people tolerate certain other supplements and binders. And then bile flow is really important to get those toxins out. And this MRP2 protein in the liver can really affect that bile flow and the bile formation and the ability to get toxin in the bile. And then there are binders to bind the bile and get the bile out with stool. And it's all, a lot of people know about binders, but they don't know upchain and they might not know why they're reacting to things or sensitive to things. So the Lyme mold guide really helps people to understand, okay, what are some of the upchain things that you can do to unblock the pathways, to be able to tolerate treatments and to start doing something and have some awareness yourself. So we explain a bit about those pathways and physiology, and then some practical tips for second steps to do if you're suspecting these issues.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. I know that people are going to want to tune in for your tips for the rest of the week. And yeah, just keep doing your awesome work.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate your bringing this information and others' information out related to fertility. Very important today.
Was that an amazing episode or what? Make sure to check our show notes so that you can link up with our guests. And if you're not a part of our secret Fertile AF community, you can join for free via the link in our show notes. Last but not least, have you showed us some love lately? It would mean the world to us if you could share and review our podcast. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time on Egg Meets Sperm. Peace.